Chapter 9. Separated. Caleb and Damon charged into the fight at the castle gates, only to see the tides of battle beginning to turn. A large gruel with black wiry hair shouted wildly, pointing his jagged weapon in the opposite direction. The remaining gruels and men tumbled over each other to follow his command. Retreat. The open expanse before the castle wall was littered with bodies and wreckage. The damaged gates and walls strung with abandoned ropes and ladders had suffered the most from the assault. As Caleb and his father surveyed the scene, watching the gruels scatter, the men of Tritus hammered their shields on their breastplates, hooting victory calls and curses to Talgarth. Caleb estimated that 200 of their men still stood, and roughly 4 times that many had been injured. He did not want to think about the dead. His stomach turned as he imagined standing before King Halus and giving the reports with Commander Arvus. The king. Is he still alive? What happened in the castle? The remaining fighters of Tritus had formed a wall in front of the gates, and the higher officers were beginning to start the slow process of post-battle procedure. A group of 30 soldiers ran after the gruels in their retreat, and a handful of others searched amongst the sea of corpses, seeking out the wounded and putting out fires. The rest remained on guard before the gates, regrouping. As soon as the last of their enemies had disappeared into the streets among the smaller buildings, Layla dashed out from her cover toward Caleb, her father close behind with his large cart bouncing behind him. "Sword girl, sword," he shouted as he ran. "Have you forgotten everything I taught you? You're on a battlefield." Caleb watched her pick a path through the bodies toward him. Obviously stunned at her surroundings, she seemed to only half hear her father's shouts, but drew her short sword from her belt. Being the daughter of one of the most renowned blacksmiths in Tritus, it followed that she had trained with various weapons. Despite that, she had never been on the field of battle before and had never seen the carnage that follows. But if any woman could handle the horror, it was she. She reached Caleb and stood with her weapon drawn. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked. "I think so," she said with a forced smile. "I just never imagined." Her thoughts shifted a little as she looked around herself again in bewilderment. Where did they all come from? Don't we patrol Avondale? Don't we have people at the ports? How could this happen? She was voicing all of the questions currently buzzing in Caleb's mind. "I don't know," he answered. "But all will be brought to light soon." Cain had dropped his cart nearby, and was 50 paces off talking with one of the soldiers near the gate. Caleb guessed he was seeking out news of his 2 sons who, from the soldiers' gestures, seemed were no longer in that part of the city. Caleb sighed with relief. "Caleb!" Damon shouted. He turned to see his father glaring into the streets where their enemies had earlier fled. "What is it, father?" He turned and looked. The Tritus men who had been sent in pursuit of the gruels emerged, running back toward the castle, weapons drawn and shouting with their arms waving above their heads. A wicked chanting started to echo from the distance. The ground pulsed beneath their feet. The soldiers behind them were running back into formation, ready to fight yet again. A second wave. "It couldn't be," Caleb muttered. "How could they have gotten so large a number without our knowledge? We won't survive a second march with the numbers we have." Damon gripped his sword and brought it up in challenge. It resonated with an unseen power. "No," he said. His thick eyebrows were low, and the white hair on his head blew in the wind with his cloak, making him look like a ragged scarecrow amidst a storm. "We have cut the bulk of their numbers. This is something different." Cain appeared behind them with his axe in his hands. "To the wall," he called. "Let us join their number or we die here." Layla returned to the alley and hide, quick. They all fled, but Layla stayed with them. Cain shot her a look but said nothing, simply pushing her deeper behind them as they joined the waiting soldiers. Caleb knew there was no use pushing her away anymore either. He stepped in front of her and gave her a reassuring nod. "The alley streets are no better than here, I suppose. How did she come to be here at the last stand? No one will touch her. Not while I'm alive." One of the soldiers shouted and pointed toward the buildings in front of them where the chanting still echoed. A large demonic figure, a black silhouette against the shades of torches behind it, walked into the clearing. It had horns on its head, and stood a full head and shoulders taller than any man. It came closer and stopped 100 paces from them. It was a giant tree of a man in heavy armor, wearing a ghoulish mask that resembled something between a smiling skull and an animal. The eyes were large, dark holes, and the flickering reflections of fire in his steel breastplate gave him a nightmarish appearance. Though he stood at a distance, a strange aura of fear seemed to spread over the corpse-paved ground toward them. Layla gasped and held her breath, and Caleb felt a chill creep up his spine. Damon seemed unaffected, but studied the man with a wary eye. "If I am not mistaken," he said to anyone close enough to hear, "before us is Lord Marmius, servant of the Lioness and second in command of Talgarth. I've seen this man once before, though under very different circumstances." Caleb looked at his father, confused. "What circumstances?" "You've met him before." "How? When?" Layla and Cain were looking at him now too, along with the surrounding soldiers. "That tale will have to wait," he said in a lower voice. He was still eyeing the metal giant whose presence had summoned the remaining Gruul minions. Caleb could not be sure, but he thought that this Lord Marmius was staring directly at his father's sword. Marmius drew his own enormous blade and held it high. A hideous booming voice erupted from behind the mask. "Maggots of Tritus. You have fought well this night, but your king and your land are doomed. Surrender in the name of Queen Tamara or be scorched by the crimson sun." All of the Tritus soldiers, including their officers, made no move, frozen in fear of the living terror that stood before them. Caleb was surprised when his father stepped forward and raised his sword above his head as well. Its white metal workings were so bright and clear that it seemed to be illuminated. Gasps of awe came from behind them, and Damon pointed it toward Marmius. "We will not stand down to you or your queen," he shouted back. "Talgarth has molested the Estelans and its people, and has now declared war on the western shores. Your influence spread to Selosia and Grimhall and now here, but here is where it will end. Talgarth will pay for this act of cowardice." Marmius was silent for a moment behind the mask, then lowered his sword. "Fool! You still carry one of the sister blades of fate," he shouted in response. "Most impressive, but even that cannot save you. Tritus, prepare to fall." He gave a wave to a man behind him, who in turn called a command back into the streets. The earth beneath their feet began to shake, as a heavy sound moved steadily towards them. As all eyes went to a large shape coming up through the night street, shouts of disbelief and distress coursed through the ranks behind Caleb. The monstrous figure stood as tall as the buildings it stalked between and was nearly as wide. Through the smoky darkness and firelight, a long thin neck stretched upward, crowned by spines, jagged fangs, and searching yellow eyes. "Fate help us," Caleb muttered. A dragon. No one he knew had ever seen one. He looked at Layla to see her eyes widen in disbelief. She shifted uneasily, and the blade of her sword quivered. Her father moved her further back behind them, and the waiting soldiers that noticed a lady present slipped her even further back. Caleb was glad she did not resist as she disappeared behind the wall of men. Shouts came from the officers for the archers to nock their arrows as Damon fell back to join his comrades. "Dragons only dwell far into the uncharted waste," Caleb shouted, searching for some kind of explanation. "How has Talgarth tamed such a thing and brought it to the west?" "Do not despair," Damon responded, looking at Caleb and Cain. Urgency laced his voice, but it held no trace of fear. "Dragons are breathing creatures like you and I. They can be slain." The beast stepped out from the street into view, and loomed high above the puny soldiers. The creature had dark red scales that flickered in the light as if it were a coat of chainmail, and its head had fin-like appendages and horns jutting behind on its neck, like hair standing on its end. Its long narrow snout was beaked at the tip and snapped at the air, revealing 2 rows of jagged teeth. Even the Gruuls and Talgarth men scrambled out of the way under its shadow, as the skin on its massive body stretched with each deep breath. Its tail flicked behind it, and its claws dug into the stone as it eyed its victims. All who stood with Caleb were struck with terror, as they gazed upon the beautiful, horrific creature of legend before them. In the moment of silence as the two forces stared at each other, Caleb thought his allies might flee, but his father held his blade high again and called for the arrows to fly. From behind him, Caleb saw 100 arrows aflame soar into the sky, their angle adjusted perfectly to ride the wind and fall directly onto the dragon's back. The flames sailed downward and rained upon the enemy, piercing gruels and igniting them into shrieking balls of fire. All watched on in disappointment, as the arrows that hit home on the great serpent cracked and broke against its hard scales, reducing the flames to a wisp of smoke. They could only fire one more volley of arrows before Marmius yelled the command, and chaos returned to the field. The remaining band of men and gruels rushed forward, screaming for blood, and the soldiers of Tritus returned the call, dashing forward with all the vigor they had left. Their screams were washed out, however, when the dragon opened its large snout and released a shrill cry that split the night and shook the foundations of the ground. With 4 massive steps it lumbered forward and stood in the heart of the battlefield. It inhaled deeper than before, and men scattered to either side, fleeing what they feared was coming. The legends were true. The ground before the dragon blazed as a scorching stream of fire blasted from its mouth. The unfortunate men who could not get away in time disappeared screaming, and their blackened armor crashed to the ground, rolling with the momentum of their final movements. The dragon began a rampage, whipping its tail against buildings and assailants and clawing men into the stone. Caleb and his father dashed and jumped clear of the creature's destructive path. As Caleb landed and rolled back to his knees, he looked frantically around for Layla and breathed a sigh of relief as he saw Cain pulling her to a darker corner of the clearing. The Talgathians were among them all now, and he watched anxiously for a second more as she and her father cut down a few gruel runts who found their hiding place. Damon devastated a few more gruels that came their way, and turned to Caleb. "We slay the beast." He charged the dragon, the hallowed blade flashing with white light. The enemies that crossed his path all died with quick dismembering blows that never broke his stride, the lucky ones to avoid him being taken down by Caleb, who was close behind. As the dragon noticed the bright light approaching, it retreated a few steps, rumbling distress in its belly. Rearing its head back, it inhaled sharply, and hurled another shot of flame at Damon. Through shielded eyes, Caleb saw his father slash at the ball of flame itself. As his sword met the attack, the flames fled from the blade and scattered in all directions, bursting into smaller streams of ember. Enraged at the unexpected defense, the dragon released another cry that tore the night sky in two. A powerful gust of wind passed over the battleground as it suddenly spread its great wings as if to fly, but after 3 heavy beats the 40-foot span retracted back to its resting place and its mass crashed back down to the stone. Caleb watched his father out of the corner of his eye as he was bombarded by a sudden slew of 6 bloodthirsty gruels. He cut a wide circle, forcing them to spread around him at a further distance, and took them down one by one, moving around the circle, handling 2 at a time. From the corner of his eye he spotted Lord Marmius bolt toward Damon and engage him. Damon repelled him with a quick stroke, and they danced on in the shadow of the dragon, sparks flying as steel crashed down against steel. He will need help. He will tire soon, no matter what sword he wields. As he did his best to make his way toward the duel, the dragon was luckily distracted. It reeled and snapped at the soldiers, hurling lances into its legs, and as a few wardens began hurling hexes toward it, it spread its wings several times as if it would rather flee than defend. He could see Damon deliberately retreating from Marmius's attacks, so as to avoid being trampled. When Caleb finally came within mere paces of his father battling the armored giant, the dragon unexpectedly whipped its head toward him and snapped viciously for the kill. He yelled and rolled to the side, and found himself for a fraction of a second staring at its outstretched wing. Without a thought, Caleb grabbed the leathery appendage firmly, and was suddenly hoisted into the air as the wing swung high. For a frozen moment he clung 50 paces above the battle, and watched his sword flip through the air as it fell. Just as quickly, the wind raced through his hair as the ground sped toward him again, the wing retracting to its natural position. A moment later, he was clinging to the creature's back. He clutched the scales and found them to be as hard as any metal. He dug his fingers beneath the iron plates as the great beast swirled and twisted in continual carnage. The world was a dark blur of red and black, and he held fast for his life, not only fearing to fall and be crushed, but also a blow from a lance or arrow from one of his own allies. With all the control he could force his weary muscles to conjure, he steadily crawled forward toward the dragon's head, using its scales and jutting horns for holds. On his belly he edged closer and closer, stopping with his head pressed to its back when it shook under the blow of an attacker. Just as Caleb realized he had no plan to bring down the beast, the unexpected happened. The wings beat again, But instead of the beat of agitation or a defense mechanism, it was the rhythmic beat of the beast beginning to take flight. The dragon cried out, and Caleb somehow felt that it was a cry of sincere pain. He clung tighter than ever and placed his feet against two small horns on the creature's back, and watched as the ground rushed steadily away from him. He saw the last images of his father and Marmius paused in their struggle, as they and the other soldiers below watched the awesome scene of the dragon taking flight. Marmius was shaking his fist up at it, and despite the mask he could almost see his face contorted in anger. Just as the people below began to blur with distance, he unmistakably saw Layla's tiny figure standing close to her father and waving her arms. Perhaps in his imagination, he could hear her clear voice calling his name as she shrank and disappeared into the dark night. The city of Tritus looked like a handful of searing coals arranged against a sheet of dark fabric, and as the dragon took him higher and higher, a breathtaking view of the entire kingdom of Avondale bloomed before his eyes. The towering teeth of the Titan mountains spiked through the earth and disappeared into the southern horizon in front of him, and to the east the land rolled on until it touched the sea, which glimmered in the waning moonlight. Dawn was nearing. Soon it all disappeared behind a stream of lacy clouds as the dragon reached the pinnacle of its ascent. It stretched its wings to the farthest width it could, then began falling back toward the ground. Caleb struggled to fight back the panic and the turning of his stomach as he tried to orient himself. The beast twirled and changed direction whenever the wind caught its wing. It roared and shot fire into the sky. Caleb's fingers bled with the grip he maintained underneath the hard scales, and he felt needles jabbing into his feet, with the uneasy feeling that he could slip and fall to his death at any second. The dragon continued its frenzy of spinning and reeling. Whether out of happiness or madness, Caleb could not be sure. At last the dragon leveled out. It flew back and forth from left to right, but was steady enough for Caleb to climb again. Before he had a plan, he was moving on his stomach again toward the head, inch by inch, and pressing hard to the scales, knowing that if the wind caught so much as a thread from his flapping cloak he would be pulled off. He noticed the pain in his lungs as he struggled to take in air, and his head felt lighter in the dizzying altitude when he looked up and saw hope. A single black-tipped arrow by some miracle had lodged in between two deep red scales near the dragon's neck. He smiled inside. "I'm going to die here. There is no stopping that. But I'll see this abomination join me yet." Now having more of a purpose than hanging for his survival, he pulled himself forward quickly toward the arrow, stopping and gripping harder when the beast rocked too hard in one direction. Ever so slowly, he inched past the wings and began to creep across the narrowing neck. His breathing was getting harder still. Colorful dots of light began to dance across his vision. His wrists were weakening. Not yet. Cannot die yet. His hand clasped around the shaft of the arrow, and with a tug he ripped it free from its place of burial. The dragon noticed. It shrieked and blasted flames again, and Caleb wrapped his arms around the neck as he would a tree as the monster spun in a complete circle. In what he thought was a final desperate movement, Caleb pulled himself the final distance and clung to the beast's horns. Desperately, he flung himself forward. One hand held fast to a horn, and the other drove the arrow hard into a large golden eye. Before he knew what was happening, the ground was speeding towards them again, a shriek ringing in his ears. Time ceased its march and sped up 1,000-fold all at once. He saw mountains and forests blurring toward them. He felt his grip loosen and the sensation of falling free through the air. Somehow he was conscious enough to see trees rushing toward him, so close now he could see the individual branches and leaves. "Father. Layla. Goodbye." He braced himself for feeling the limbs and rocks pass through his body and break him to pieces, but just as his vision was failing, a massive dragon wing spread under him and covered all he could see in a bony blanket of dark red veins.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.